When I got hired as a night shift security guard at the Riverside Mall, I thought it would be an easy gig. The place was huge, 3 floors of glossy storefronts, a fountain in the center, and one of those sprawling food courts that could fit a small village. It was an older mall, the kind that had seen better days, but it still had a steady flow of visitors during the daytime. By the time I started my shift, though, the mall was a ghost town. On my first night, I took my rounds with a sense of curiosity and caution, marveling at the quiet emptiness. I thought it was kind of nice. I imagined the hours ticking by smoothly, just me, some screens, and the occasional walk around to make sure everything was in order. But around 2 a.m., I noticed something odd on one of the monitors. There was a figure standing in the middle of the atrium, right by the fountain. I squinted at the screen, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but no, there was definitely someone there. It struck me as strange the mall had been locked down for hours, and no one was supposed to be inside. I figured maybe it was a maintenance worker or someone who had fallen asleep and got locked in by accident. Grabbing my flashlight and radio, I headed over to the atrium. The entire time I felt an odd heaviness, a tension building as I walked through the empty halls. My footsteps echoed around me, and the silence was almost oppressive. As I got closer to the fountain, I could make out the figure more clearly, a man standing perfectly still, facing the water. I could not tell if he was looking at me or at the fountain. Something about his posture seemed wrong, as though he were unnaturally stiff. I cleared my throat, trying to sound authoritative, and asked if he needed any help. The man did not move, did not even twitch. Feeling a chill creep up my spine, I approached slowly, my flashlight trained on him. His clothes looked ordinary, jeans and a dark jacket, but his stillness was unsettling, like he was frozen in place. I called out again, "Sir." The mall is closed, but he remained silent, staring into the water with an expression I could not quite place. It was almost a smile, but not quite, a faint curl at the edge of his lips that made me feel like I had interrupted something private. As I got within a few feet of him, I noticed his face was unusually pale, almost waxy. His eyes were wide open, staring right through me. I felt a sense of unease, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. Still, I reached out and gently touched his shoulder, trying to get his attention. The man turned, very slowly, and looked at me. His gaze was blank, his eyes dark and empty, and for a moment I thought I was looking at a mannequin. Then he blinked, and I realized he was very much alive, or at least he was something close to it. I swallowed, trying to keep my voice steady, and said, "Sir, you need to leave." But he just stood there, staring at me with that half smile, like he knew something I didn't. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, and finally I backed away. My mind was racing, and all I wanted to do was get out of there. I quickly returned to the security office, hoping to shake off the eerie encounter. But when I checked the monitors, my heart stopped. The screen showed me standing by the fountain, talking to nothing. There was no one else there. The man hadn't appeared on the footage at all. I rewound and watched again, convinced that I must have made a mistake. But every time it was just me, standing alone in the atrium, talking to empty air. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd imagined it. But as the night wore on, a feeling of dread settled over me. Every little noise, every flicker of light made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. When morning came, I left the mall in a hurry, glad to be out of that empty building. I convinced myself that it had just been my imagination, that maybe the long hours in the isolation were messing with my head. But the next night, as soon as I settled in, I saw him again. This time he appeared in the middle of the food court, standing perfectly still, staring at one of the tables. I watched him on the monitor, trying to convince myself it was some kind of glitch. But then he turned, ever so slowly, and looked directly into the camera. I felt a chill down my spine, like he could see me watching him. Once again, I went out to investigate, my heart pounding as I approached the food court. But when I got there, the space was empty. No sign of anyone. I scanned the area, even checked the storage rooms, but I was completely alone. Night after night, the figure continued to appear, always in different parts of the mall. Sometimes he was by the escalators, other times near the clothing stores, always standing perfectly still, watching. Each time, he vanished as soon as I tried to confront him, leaving me shaken and unnerved. One evening, desperate for answers, I brought it up with one of the older guards who had worked the day shift for years. He gave me a strange look and said, "I heard rumors about a man who used to come here every day, always sitting by the fountain. Apparently he had some kind of breakdown and died right there on the marble floor. They say he never really left." I laughed it off, trying to act like I didn't believe in ghost stories, but inside I felt a creeping sense of dread. The figure's appearances became more frequent after that, and each time he seemed to get a little closer, lingering just long enough to make me feel like he was waiting for something. One night I saw him in the security office on the monitor, standing right behind my chair. I spun around, heart racing, but of course no one was there. I could almost feel him though, a cold presence pressing in on me, as if he were standing just out of sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I requested to be moved to the day shift, citing personal reasons, and after a few weeks my supervisor agreed. I left the night shift behind, but the memories of those eerie encounters stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I never told anyone else, not fully, but sometimes I'd see the newer night guards coming in, looking fresh and cheerful, and I'd feel a pang of guilt. Part of me wanted to warn them, but I wasn't sure they'd believe me. As for the man by the fountain, I don't know if he's still there, haunting those empty halls after dark. But every now and then, when I passed the mall in the early morning, I glanced toward the atrium and imagined him standing there, waiting, his dark eyes staring into the distance. And I wonder if someday he'll find someone else to keep him company in the quiet, lonely hours of the night. When I was offered the chance to work as a night clerk at one of the busiest convenience stores in town, I jumped at the opportunity. The pay wasn't amazing, but the shift hours suited me, and I figured I'd spend most of the night checking my phone and stocking shelves. The store sat at a busy intersection, right on the edge of the downtown area, which meant there was always a steady stream of customers, even late into the night. At first, everything was fine. I got used to the usual types of customers that came in at night: tired cab drivers, groups of college kids grabbing snacks after a night out, and the occasional sketchy character looking for cheap beer or cigarettes. It was all routine, and for the most part, I felt safe behind the counter, separated from the rest of the store by a thick pane of glass. But after about a month, I started noticing him. A man would come into the store around 3 a.m., like clockwork, and he always seemed to know exactly what he wanted. He never lingered, never browsed. He would walk straight to the back, grab a bottle of water, and head up to the counter to pay. He was quiet, polite even, always saying thank you before heading out into the night. The first few times, I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just another regular, someone who lived nearby and worked an odd shift like I did. But as the weeks went on, I started to feel uneasy around him. Maybe it was the way he moved, or the way his eyes seemed to follow me even after I handed him his change. There was something about him that made my skin crawl, a sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite put into words. One night, around 3 a.m., he came in as usual. I was already tense, watching him from the corner of my eye as he grabbed his bottle of water. But instead of heading to the counter, he stopped in the middle of the aisle, turning to face me. His eyes were dark, his face expressionless, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something. But he just stood there, staring at me, unmoving. I felt my heart start to race, but I forced myself to act normal. I cleared my throat and asked if he needed anything else, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me, his eyes unblinking. After what felt like an eternity, he finally walked up to the counter, placed the bottle on the glass, and held out his money without saying a word. I handed him his change, and he left without a sound. But as he walked out, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His reflection in the glass door seemed wrong. It was like a shadow, darker and distorted, and when he walked out, it lingered for just a second too long, as if it didn't want to leave. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was just tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the feeling of dread stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me with those empty eyes. The next night I was dreading 3 a.m., already on edge as I watched the minutes tick by. Sure enough, right on schedule, he walked in. This time, he didn't go straight to the back. He stopped by the door, his eyes fixed on me, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to move. Finally, he walked over to the counter without picking up anything, just standing there in front of me, silent. I asked if I could help him, my voice barely more than a whisper. He leaned in, his face inches from the glass, and said, in a low voice, "Do you know what time it is?" The question sent a chill down my spine, and I stammered, glancing at the clock on the wall. I told him it was just past 3, but he shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. "No," he said, "it's almost time." I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't want to ask. I just wanted him to leave. But he stayed there, watching me with that same unsettling stare, and I felt like he was waiting for something. Finally, he turned and walked out, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark stain. After that, things only got worse. Every night, he would come in at 3 a.m., never saying anything, just standing by the counter or staring at me from across the store. I felt like he was trying to communicate something, but I didn't know what. All I knew was that his presence filled me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, a fear that grew stronger with each passing night. One night, around 3:15, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I told my manager about the man, about how he came in every night and how he never seemed to buy anything. My manager looked at me, his brow furrowed, and said, "What man?" Confused, I tried to explain, describing him in as much detail as I could, but my manager just shook his head. He told me that the cameras had been acting up lately, glitching during the night shift, but he had never seen anyone on the footage that matched my description. He suggested that maybe I was just tired, that maybe the late hours were getting to me. I didn't know what to think, but the next night I was ready. I set my phone to record as soon as I saw him walk through the door, hoping to capture proof that he was real. I watched him, my heart pounding as he approached the counter, his eyes dark and hollow. He stopped in front of me, and I felt a chill wash over me as he leaned in close, his breath fogging up the glass. He whispered, "It's time," and then he walked out, disappearing into the darkness. I waited until I was sure he was gone, then grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I checked the footage. There was nothing there, just an empty store, quiet and still. I watched the video over and over, but every time it was the same. No sign of the man, no record of him ever being there. It was like he didn't exist, like he was some kind of phantom that only I could see. After that, I couldn't keep working the night shift. I asked my manager to move me to the day shift, and thankfully he agreed. But even now, months later, I still think about that man, about the way he would stare at me with those empty eyes, like he was waiting for something. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I feel like he's still watching me, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear again. And every now and then, when the clock strikes 3 a.m., I hear his voice in my mind whispering, There was something. It was a slow night at the convenience store, the kind of shift that dragged on forever. The rain outside had kept most customers away, and I had been passing the time by restocking shelves and wiping down the counter. The store's fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting a cold, sterile glow over everything. It was almost midnight, and I had about 2 hours left on my shift. Just as I finished restocking the candy aisle, the bell above the door chimed. I looked up and saw a man walk in, soaked from the rain. He wore a long, dark coat that was dripping wet, and his hair was plastered to his forehead. He didn't look like a regular customer. He was too well dressed, like he'd stepped out of an old movie, and something about him just felt off. The man walked straight to the back of the store, disappearing down the snack aisle. I went back to the counter, keeping an eye on him. A few minutes passed, but he didn't come back. I glanced down the aisle, expecting to see him choosing between chips or cookies, but the aisle was empty. I waited a little longer, wondering if he was still in the store. I hadn't seen him leave, and the bell hadn't chimed again. Just as I was starting to feel uneasy, I heard a faint rustling sound from the storage room in the back. I hesitated, then slowly made my way over, my heart pounding in my chest. I opened the door to the storage room and looked inside. It was empty, just shelves lined with stock boxes and cleaning supplies. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that maybe the guy had just slipped out without me noticing. I turned to go back to the counter, but as I stepped out of the storage room, I nearly ran into the man. He was standing right outside the door, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He didn't say a word, just looked at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I asked if he needed any help, trying to keep my voice steady. He tilted his head slightly, as if he were studying me, and then he finally spoke. His voice was low and rough, like he hadn't used it in a long time, and he asked me if we sold matches. I told him we didn't, and he just stood there, not moving, not saying anything. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. After a long pause, he gave me a strange smile and thanked me, then turned and walked back toward the front of the store. I watched him go, feeling a sense of relief as he approached the door. But instead of leaving, he stopped just before he reached it and turned back to look at me. He said, in that same low voice, "I hope you have a backup plan." Then he walked out into the rain, the door chime echoing in the empty store. I stood there, trying to process what he'd said, but it didn't make any sense. I hoped it was just some odd comment, the kind that lonely people make when they're looking for any kind of interaction, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd meant something more. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man and his strange parting words. When I finally clocked out and left the store, I noticed that the rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet and deserted. I got in my car, started the engine, and tried to put the night behind me. But as I drove home, I started noticing something strange. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. Just a dark shape, motionless, watching as I drove by. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the shadows cast by the streetlights. But as I got closer to home, the sightings became more frequent, until I could barely look in the mirror without seeing that same dark shape. By the time I reached my apartment, I was shaking. I parked and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was overreacting to a strange encounter. But that night, I barely slept, too afraid to look out the window or check the peephole. The next day, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a misunderstanding, that the man had just been a creepy stranger who'd gotten in my head. But as the night shift approached again, I felt a growing sense of dread. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that I was going to see him again. Sure enough, at exactly the same time as the night before, the man walked in. He was wearing the same soaked coat, his hair still plastered to his head, as if he hadn't been anywhere else since the last time I'd seen him. He walked to the counter this time, not bothering to browse the aisles. He looked at me with that same intense gaze, then asked in his rough voice if I'd found those matches. I told him again that we didn't have any, trying to sound as polite and calm as possible. He nodded, then leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "You're going to need them soon." My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stay calm. I asked what he meant, but he just smiled that strange smile again and turned to leave. Just like the night before, he stopped at the door, glanced back at me, and said, "Hope you have a backup plan." Then he walked out into the night, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the eerie silence of the store. I went through the rest of my shift on edge, jumping at every sound, expecting him to appear in the aisles again. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran to my car, feeling exposed and vulnerable in the empty parking lot. I drove home, my hands shaking on the wheel, and locked myself inside as soon as I arrived. The following night, I called in sick. I told my manager I wasn't feeling well, that I needed a break. He sounded annoyed, but he agreed to cover my shift. I spent the night at home, but I couldn't relax. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man's face, heard his voice telling me I'd need those matches. A week later, I learned that the convenience store had burned down. The fire started late at night, spreading quickly through the building before anyone could do anything to stop it. The store was a total loss, reduced to ashes and charred rubble. I stood across the street, watching as the fire crews worked to put out the last smoldering embers. I thought about the man in the rain-soaked coat, about his strange words and his unsettling smile. I didn't know who he was or what he'd wanted, but one thing was clear. I'd had a narrow escape, and whatever that man had planned, he'd made sure that only I would understand the warning he left behind. The convenience store where I worked was open 24 hours and night shifts were a regular part of the job. I didn't mind working late. The store was usually quiet, and it was a small place on the outskirts of town, far enough from the main road that we didn't get much foot traffic after midnight. On a typical night, I'd see maybe 3 or 4 customers, most of them regulars or truck drivers passing through. One night, though, things were different. It was around 2 a.m., and I was restocking the coolers in the back when I heard the bell over the door chime. I peered through the shelves, expecting to see a tired-looking driver or one of the usual late-night faces. But instead, a man walked in who I'd never seen before. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong in a small convenience store in the middle of the night. He wore a long, dark coat that seemed too formal for a place like this, and he had a hat pulled low over his face. He walked slowly, as if he were taking in every detail of the store, his gaze lingering on the aisles and the shelves. I went back to the counter, waiting for him to approach, but he didn't. Instead, he walked down each aisle, looking at the items as though he were trying to memorize them. After a few minutes, he finally came to the counter and stood there, staring at me. His face was mostly hidden by the shadow of his hat, but I could see his eyes. They were dark and cold, and they seemed to look right through me. He asked if I had a specific brand of cigarettes, one I'd never heard of. I told him we didn't carry it, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, like he'd expected that answer, and then asked if I'd ever worked the night shift somewhere else. I didn't know. His question was strange, almost personal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was studying my every reaction. I told him I'd worked here for a while, keeping my answer short. He didn't respond, just kept staring at me with that unsettling look. After a long silence, he finally said, "I'll be back tomorrow." And then he left, leaving me standing there with a chill that had nothing to do with the coolers behind me. The next night, I couldn't get his words out of my head. I kept expecting him to walk through the door again, to stand there and stare at me with those cold eyes. But the night passed without any sign of him, and I began to think I'd just let my imagination get the best of me. Maybe he'd just been a strange customer, someone passing through who I'd never see again. A few nights later, I was working another late shift. The store was quiet, and I was halfway through my shift when I heard the door chime. I looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway. He was dressed the same as before, his hat pulled low and his coat buttoned up, even though it was a warm night. He walked up to the counter without a word, his eyes locked on me. I forced myself to act normal, asking if he needed help finding anything. He didn't answer right away, just tilted his head slightly, like he was trying to decide something. Then he leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper, and asked if I'd had any strange visitors recently. The question caught me off guard, and I stammered that I hadn't, that it had been a quiet week. He nodded slowly, as if he were weighing my answer, and then he said something that sent a chill down my spine. He said, "You should be careful around here. Not everyone who comes in means well." I didn't know what to say. His words felt like a warning, but I didn't understand why he'd give it. I forced a nervous smile, telling him I'd keep that in mind. He watched me for a moment longer, then turned and walked out, leaving me feeling more unsettled than ever. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started to notice shadows outside the store late at night, figures that seemed to lurk just out of sight. Once, when I was taking out the trash, I thought I saw someone watching me from across the street, but when I looked again, they were gone. A week later, the man returned. This time, he didn't walk around the store or ask any strange questions. He went straight to the counter and placed a $1 bill in front of me. I looked at him, confused, and asked if he was buying something. He didn't answer, just looked at me like I didn't know what he meant, but I felt a cold dread creeping over me. He pushed the dollar closer, then turned and left without another word. When he was gone, I picked up the dollar and unfolded it. Written across the top in small, neat handwriting were the words, "Don't trust anyone who walks in after midnight." I felt a shiver go down my spine. I didn't know what to make of the message, but I couldn't deny that it felt like a warning. Over the next few nights, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I watched every customer more closely, looking for any sign that they might be hiding something. The late night shifts took on a new edge, a feeling of paranoia that I couldn't shake. One night, just as I was about to close up, a man walked in. He was unsteady on his feet, his clothes dirty and worn. He stumbled to the counter, asking for a pack of cigarettes, and I felt the familiar dread creeping in. I handed him the cigarettes, trying to keep my distance, but he grabbed my hand, his grip tight and desperate. He leaned in, his breath reeking of alcohol, and said, "He was right, you know." I tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. He looked at me with wild, terrified eyes and said, "You're in danger here. They're watching you." I finally managed to pull free, my heart pounding as I backed away. He staggered out of the store, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. I looked down at the dollar bill in my hand, the warning written across it, and I felt a sense of dread settle over me. I quit the job the next day. I didn't know who the man in the coat was or why he'd warned me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd saved me from something terrible. I never went back to that convenience store, and to this day I wonder what might have happened if I hadn't listened. There was something.